The Holy Prophet Muhammad has said, surely there exists within the heart of the mu'mineen with respect to the martyrdom of al-Hussain a heat and a fire which never subsides. When we commemorate the tragedy of Imam Hussain alayhi salam and the other Imams and the members of the Holy Prophet's family, the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, there are different forms of mourning which take place, and there are different forms of service which we can do as our Imams have told us to do. Some of these include reading poetry, reciting lamentations, serving food to guests, donating our blood to save lives, and even distributing tissues in the mosques or in the Hussainiyas to catch the tears of the weeping believers. All of these are acceptable customs and traditions and forms of mourning which have been recommended in the service of Abu Abdullah. Organising mourning ceremonies or majalis in memory of Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam and the other awliya of Allah is another way of paying respect to the signs of Allah. And this can take the form of, as we mentioned, establishing gatherings to commemorate their lives, to commemorate their martyrdoms, and to commemorate the legacy and the message which they left behind. Of course, with Imam Hussain alayhi salam, this relates to speaking out against oppression in whatever form it takes, wherever it takes place. And as we know, especially during the month of Muharram, Muslims all across the world, from whatever ethnicity or nationality they may come from, establish these memorial ceremonies in order to honour Imam al-Hussein's martyrdom, to recite the details of his suffering and the hardships which were imposed on him, upon his family and his companions, in order for us to continue the legacy of keeping his message against corruption alive. It is narrated that one day the Holy Prophet of Islam, Rasulullah, started crying. One of the companions comes to him and he asks him, Ya Rasulullah, why is it that you cry and shed tears on this day? What is it that has caused you to weep? The Prophet responded by saying that Jibreel has told me that my child al-Hussain will be killed in a land called al-Taf, and he brought clay for me from that land, and he also informed me that al-Hussain will be buried in that same place in which he was slaughtered in. If we talk about mourning for Abu Abdullah and the grief which we show, we need to establish what this means and what Aza al-Hussain actually means. Of course, as I mentioned, Aza al-Hussain takes different forms, such as the mourning congregations, such as the lamentations, the latam, and all of the actions which express our emotions and which express our grief openly, which express our anger towards the tyranny of Yazid and everything which he and his cronies stood for. These emotions, however, and these actions that we carry out amongst ourselves and amongst our circles in our Hussainiyas will remain futile. They will remain hypocritical and pointless unless we accompany with them with a will inside our hearts to reform not just ourselves at the individual level, but also to try and reform at the societal level as well, as stated by the Imam when he set out his rules and conditions for why he had went to the land of Karbala. Therefore, it's important that we don't lose the reason as to why we are carrying out this grief and these mourning acts for the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. The first reason which we need to remember, and the first reason which we should be holding on to, is that we should be making a stand, as I mentioned, both personally and in terms of societal level as well, in remembrance of the Ahlul Bayt. Secondly, we should be attempting to reform ourselves by the remembrance of the concept of enjoining and promoting what is good and forbidding what is evil and haram. Thirdly, we should be attempting to revive the message and the true message of al-Hussain and his companions. And lastly, we should be setting out to learn and to follow the sunnah of the Holy Prophet and of the Imams and members of the Ahlul Bayt as well. Our majalis, our latmiyat, our latam, our tears should all be moving us intellectually, should be moving us spiritually and emotionally towards these purposes which I just mentioned. They should not be done as demonstrative purposes only with no meaning behind them. Once we do this, and once we focus on the reasons why we are carrying out these mourning commemorations, only then will we be able to achieve the maximum out of the concept of Aza itself, and to fulfill our pledge to Imam Hussain, that if we were in the land of Karbala with you, we would not leave you alone. If we existed at the time of the Battle of Ashura, we would be amongst those who came to support you. My focus today will be more so on a specific concept in Aza, which is concerning the act of latam itself, considering the act of beating our chests, beating our faces and our bodies in remembrance of our Abdullah. The reason why I've decided to focus on this today is because as followers of the Ahlul Bayt, we are known for many things. We are known for our devotion towards the Ahlul Bayt. We are known for our devotion to commemorating them as has been instructed by the Holy Prophet. But one of the things which we have become most well known for is the concept of latam, the concept of beating our chests. It's become one of the defining factors which non-Shi'as and non-Muslims as well have associated with our school of thought and with our madhab. Now, Imam Khamenei, for example, says that the hitting of the chest and the hitting of the face and the shedding of our tears for Aba Abdullah is the most valuable thing which can possibly exist in the treasures of humanity and which must be preserved. This is a concept which we need to hold on to and which I'll go on to explain a little bit more. We've talked then about the purpose of Aza, we've talked about the purpose of latam in terms of reviving and remembering the message of al-Hussain. But what I also mentioned was to be following the sunnah of the Holy Prophet and of the Imams. Now if we talk about something like this, I'm forced to then bring up proofs to this concept of Aza and specifically latam, which have been found not just in our books, but much higher up than that as well. We need to concern ourselves with this question when we are approached by non-Shi'as, when they ask us about the topic of latam specifically. How can we prove this? How can we prove that this is a concept which is Islamically permissible and is something in which is actually mustahab and is encouraged for us to do? When we talk about the proofs that we need to give, there are basically and generally three types of proof. We have the Holy Quran, the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We have our ahadith, our traditions and our narrations, and we also have the sunnah of the Holy Prophet and of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. And also concerning the sunnah of the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt, we also have incidents and indications of their permission of something, whether they have remained silent on it or whether they have spoken about it. Usually when we discuss the proofs of something, we start with the Holy Quran and then we work our way down to the Holy Prophet and then to the narrations of Ahlul Bayt and then to anything else. But today I'm going to go in the reverse order of legitimacy. And there is a reason for this, so that we can build up our proofs and so that we can start at a level where we are able to tell people about the concept of latam and the proofs that we have for it. If we start off then by going in the reverse order of legitimacy, we start with the books of our brothers and Ahlul Sunnah. One of the accusations towards us is that the concept of latam is purely a concept which the followers of the Ahlul Bayt, specifically the Ithna Ashari Shi'as, do. And that this action is limited to them and it is limited to their figures and to their books. However, we have narrations that mention that certain Sahaba were narrated to have beat themselves, to have beat their bodies in times of grief, in times of sorrow, and in times of mourning, both during the lifetime of the Holy Prophet and after the lifetime of the Holy Prophet. In one of the books from the brothers in Ahlul Sunnah, which is called Aqd al-Farid, it is narrated that when Umar ibn al-Khattab received the news of the death of Nu'man, he began to beat his head. And he screamed out and wailed, "Oh my grief for Nu'man." This is one of the three caliphs which our brothers in Ahlul Sunnah believe in. From their works, they also concede that one of the actions he committed in terms of showing his grief was to do latam. In the Sunni history book, al-Tabari, we have a narration from Aisha, which says that Rasulullah died on my chest. I laid his head on a pillow and I got up, beating my chest and slapping my face along with the other women. Therefore, we have two of the most prominent figures from the madhab of the Ahlul Sunnah who have engaged and who have permitted the concept of latam in times of grief. This is all very well and good if we are talking to our Sunni brothers regarding latam. But we need to understand this concept from our own books as well and from our own literature. For example, we see Imam Zayn al-Abidin alayhi salam, that when the caravan of the captives of Bani Hashim were leaving Karbala, the women of Bani Hashim were brought to see the dead bodies of the martyrs, of the shuhada, and the bloodied wounds in which they had upon their bodies. And upon seeing these, the women of Bani Hashim began to slap their faces, and they began to scream out in grief and in pain in front of Sayyidah Zainab and others from the family of the Holy Prophet. Now Imam Zayn al-Abidin was present, and he witnessed these women slapping their faces and chests and wailing out in grief for the martyrs of the Ahlul Bayt. Did the Imam object to this? Did he forbid them from carrying out this action? No. For 3 days, whilst the women grieved and whilst the women suffered by carrying out these acts, the Imam stayed silent and did not utter one single word of condemnation towards them. He did not at one time or at one point order them to stop in their mourning. Therefore, for those 3 days where he did not object to this act of latam being practiced, it indicates that the Imam views this as something which is permissible, something which is allowed, and something which is halal. Secondly, when Imam Sajjad alayhi salam came close to Medina, one of the companions, one of the Sahaba called Bishr, began to recite some poetry. And when he was reading this poetry, the women who typically at that time in Medina did not leave their houses due to the customary practices of the time, they began to come out of their houses and they began to wail out and they began to scratch their faces in front of the Imam. This is the next step forward from slapping. They began to scratch their faces. Again, the Imam did not object to this. Some people would say, well, if the Imam is not objecting to it, that doesn't mean that he is saying that we should do it. The concept of the Imam staying silent is a very interesting one. And if we use our rational mind and our logic to understand why he stayed silent, we'll come to a conclusion. Imagine right now that you are standing in front of Imam Sajjad alayhi salam, and you're in a gathering with him, and you take out some food. And the food that you take out is pork, it is the pig meat. And you begin eating this in front of the Imam. You as a Muslim are eating something which is pig meat. Is the Imam going to sit by and let you eat this meat? Or is he going to interject and say this is a wrong thing to do? This is something which has been forbidden by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Do not do it. Of course he's going to do this. He is going to forbid evil and enjoin what is good. Therefore, when the Imam sees people engaging in latam and he does not object to them doing this, then his silence means that this is a permissible action. Thirdly, if we look to Imam Rida, specifically in the story of Di'bil al-Khuzai, one of the famous poets and the lovers of the Ahlul Bayt, we see another proof. In this poetry, which he reads in front of Imam Rida, he talks about the tragedy of Muharram. And he says, Ya Fatima, if you had seen what had happened to you, then you would have slapped your cheek at that moment. This is someone reading poetry in front of the Imam, where he says that Lady Fatima would have committed the act of latam. How did the Imam react to this? The way in which he reacted was that he began to cry with intense grief. And he asked this poet who had read this poetry, directly after this line to reward him with a great blessing and reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The last piece of evidence which I'll present today is direct confirmation from the Imam. And it is from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, who says that hitting the face is nothing but seeking forgiveness and repentance, because the women from amongst the descendants of Fatima hit their faces when mourning for Imam Hussain. For people like al-Hussain, we should hit our faces and rend our clothes. Sheikh al-Mufid also narrated from Sayyidah Zainab that when she heard her brother al-Hussain reading his last verses, she began to slap her face and she passed out from the grief as a result of it. Finally, Jabir asked Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam. He asked Imam al-Baqir to explain what grief or what jaza meant. And he said that the most intense grief is yelling. The most intense grief is crying. The most intense grief is hitting the face and hitting the chest. Now from our perspective, when we have these narrations, this seems to be everything that we need. However, some people will still not accept this. Some people will say, as they often do with matters of religion, prove this to me from the words of the Holy Quran. In fact, don't just give me a verse or a reference which vaguely touches on the concept and can be interpreted in a different way. Give me explicit proof from the Holy Quran that this concept of latam is something which is mentioned and accepted. Therefore, we can take the Holy Quran just now. Anyone can go and read on their phone. In the Quran, we read that Lady Sarah, the wife of Nabi Ibrahim, struck her face and slapped her face when she was told that she was going to conceive a baby. The verse explicitly says, "Then came forward his wife in grief. She struck her face and said, 'What, me, an old barren woman?'" We have an explicit verse from the Holy Quran which does not condemn the act of latam, which in fact mentions it, and mentions it as a natural reaction of an individual when feeling grief. Therefore, we have confirmation from the books of Ahlul Sunnah, from the books of the Shia, and from the Holy Quran itself, that this is an action which there is no problem in doing. And in fact, is permissible and is actually recommended, especially when it is recommended for the sake of Abu Abdullah. Now when we talk about mourning in Muharram, unfortunately there are some people who exceed the limits and exceed what is acceptable when grieving. And we need to tell these people and inform these people that perhaps there is a better way for them to mourn and for them to grieve, which has been defined and which has been accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Ahlul Bayt. When we talk about these people who exceed the limits, for example, we have Sayyid al-Khou'i, who says that if some of these rituals, which include blood and hitting oneself with chains, which are practiced in Muharram, cause serious harm to the body, or they harm or ridicule the religion and the madhab, then this is something haram. If we go past the stage of what is acceptable, then we are in dangerous territory, and we have changed it from something which is halal and mustahab into something which is haram. We also have Sayyid Muhammad Sayyid al-Hakim, may Allah have mercy on his soul, who says that one should avoid performing such actions in a place where the reputation of the Shi'as may become damaged. And it is important that we take these pieces of advice into account when we perform our actions during the month of Muharram, and to make sure that we do not exceed the limits and to do something which is impermissible. We should encourage, however, healthy debate amongst people who carry out certain actions which may be beyond the limits. We should not go to them with anger and with insults and abuse. We should approach them in a loving manner, because certain people have such an intense flame in their hearts for Abu Abdullah that their grief can sometimes carry over to a point which is not acceptable. However, we do not approach this with arrogance or rudeness. We approach this with kindness and understanding in order to try and guide them to the right approach. And the right approach is mentioned by Sayyid Ali Sistani. Sayyid Ali Sistani says that the philosophy of mourning, the philosophy of Azar during Ashura, is to respect the symbols of religion and to remember the suffering of al-Hussain, his companions, his uprising and his revolution to defend Islam and to prevent the destruction of the religion by Bani Umayyah. These rituals and these actions which are done in mourning must be done in such a way that in addition to serving its purpose, it draws the attention of others to these noble goals of al-Hussain. So, Sayyid Sistani says, any actions which are not understandable and cause misunderstandings and contempt and hatred for the religion must be avoided. These are very clear words which do not require much more explanation, as I would not be able to expand on this beautiful saying. Now, some people will come and still have objections to Azza and specifically to Latam. Some people will say that this is an act of self-harm. Firstly, in response to someone who claims that Latam is an act of self-harm, you must point them first to the Islamic definition of what self-harm is. You must go and speak to a learned scholar who will be able to tell you the Shari'i rulings regarding what is self-harm. And once this is explained to them, whether it is from a Shia Sheikh or a Sunni Sheikh, they will come to the understanding that Latam does not fall under the category of self-harm in Islam. One of the other objections which we have is, what is the purpose of it? Why do we mourn? If you read about the tragedy of Ashura in itself, this question is not something which would need to be answered. If you read about the tragedy which was inflicted, not just on al-Hussain, but on the children of al-Hussain, on the women of al-Hussain, then this is a question which does not need to be answered. Some people will say that Latam is embarrassing and it makes us look bad. The response to this objection is that when we go to Hajj and we throw stones and we throw rocks at a wall, non-Muslims will look at this and they will say, this makes no sense. This is embarrassing. Why do people travel to the other side of the world to go and throw stones at a wall? Anyone who comes with this preconceived notion in their mind will not be willing to accept the reality or to accept the intention behind this act. If you're concerned about the view of non-Muslims as to how Latam makes you look and how it makes your religion look, even though it's something which has been accepted and which we have been told is permissible, then how would you react when a non-Muslim looks at us fasting during the month of Shahr Ramadan? They will look at us and think that we are a weird religion and that we starve ourselves throughout the day and that we are causing harm to ourselves by not at least drinking water. Would we accept this? Would we then stop the concept of fasting during Shahr Ramadan just because it makes us look bad, it may make us look backwards? No, we wouldn't do this. In life, and specifically this dunya, it is meant for others to look on us and to judge us and to judge us harshly. It is easy for people to look at us and to judge and to have misconceptions. However, the test truly is in whether we hold firm to our faith and our beliefs and we do not concede to the secular people or the non-religious people or the non-Muslims in respect of what their view towards us is. If these rituals are mentioned in the Holy Quran itself and they are mentioned in our ahadith and our imams have encouraged us to do them, then who are we and who is anyone to come and to say that these make us look bad and that we should stop doing them? Only when they exceed the limits is this an acceptable answer. The institution of Azza, the institution of mourning for Abu Abdullah, is like a school. If there is a problem within this school, then the right approach is not to get rid of the entire school itself. but to try and reform it, to try and polish it so that it becomes the beautiful gem that it is. If we give up on the concept of Aza and mourning for Imam Hussain, then we have succumbed to the desires of Yazid, to the desires of Mutawakkil and other oppressors and tyrants who wish to silence the commemoration of the tragedy of Imam Hussain. And something I want to reiterate to finish is that we cannot perpetuate this illusion that Aza al-Hussain means no more than giving a few tears every night for 10 days. Means no more than beating our chests and going on a masira without any thought behind why we are doing it. It doesn't mean that we come to the Husayniyah 10 times out of the entire year, and when the muhadara is going on, or when the sheikh comes and speaks, we go and stand outside and we smoke cigarettes. And then when the latam starts, we come in and we stand in the middle and make a scene out of ourselves. Imam Hussain advised one of the Muslims who was claiming to be from the Shia to fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to not make any false claims, or else on the day of judgment he would be raised with the liars. The Imam says our Shia are the ones whose hearts are free from malice, deception and corruption, and his words and his deeds are for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only. The one who conducts Aza not for Al-Hussein, not for the purpose of serving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but rather to gain fame in this world and to show off and to boast his arrogance, is not from the Shia and is not from the lovers of Imam Hussain. Muharram is now. We're on the 6th night of Muharram and the tragedy of Ashura is soon approaching. Can we sit here and can we make a commitment to Imam Hussein's objectives and to his revolution and all of the principles which are embodied in this revolution? Or do we wish to try and stay in the current state which we are in, where we only give lip service to Abu Abdullah, where we only remember him by words and not with true actions? Are we going to limit ourselves to demonstrative mourning only, or are we going to use these mourning rituals to further enlighten us in order to spread the message of Abu Abdullah? And the person who sums this up perfectly is Sheikh Ahmed al-Wa'ili, may Allah have mercy on his soul. He says that Imam Hussain alayhi salam does not need your latam. He does not need your slapping on the back with change. He does not need you to strike your head with the sword. What he does need you to do is to stand for the oppressed people in any form, reject staying quiet in the face of tyranny, and propagating true Islam in its entirety, and making peace with the concept of sacrifice. And this is what we must also bring along with our Aza and our mourning. Tonight, and for the next few nights, up until Ashura, and even until the 40 days has ended, do latam. Beat your chests, beat your faces, do zanjil, but don't limit yourself just to these actions for Imam Hussain. Imam Hussain demands more from you. Imam Hussain demands you to go and stand in George Square or Buchanan Street every Saturday and stand for the oppressed people in Gaza. Imam Hussain wants you to speak up against the system of Yazid, whether that be 1300 years ago or whether it be present today in this world. This is what Aza al-Hussain truly means, to couple our religious rituals with the objectives and the goals stated by the Imam when he was slain in the battlefields of Karbala. And to finish, I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have mercy and to grant patience and ease to the victims of oppression in this world, and to have mercy on the souls of the shuhada. And for all the shuhada, I ask you to recite Surah Al-Fatiha after Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.